Welcome to Canonically Speaking, a podcast featuring conversations with individuals from the world of canon law, inviting them to share their special expertise or insights into some particular aspect of canon law which will be of interest and benefit to others in the canonical world. Today our podcast comes from the village of Kelvedon in Essex, where I'm here to meet Mgr Gordon Read, parish priest of the Church of St Mary Immaculate and the Holy Archangels, a small, charming, late Victorian Gothic building dating from the 1890s. And I believe, Monsignor, that the church includes amongst its former clergy at least one figure of renown.
That's right. So Father Thomas Biles, who is famed for being a priest who went down with the Titanic, he was here just for a few months, 1905 to 1906.
Now, it may seem that to be parish priest of a small semi-rural church would be an idyllic existence, and well it might be, were it not for the fact that for the last 40 years or so, Mgr Gordon has also been the full-time Judicial Vicar and Chancellor of the Diocese of Brentwood, combining those roles with a prolific output in terms of canonical articles and commentaries. He's produced well over 80 such writings, and each topic he's dealt with has been meticulously researched and referenced and set in its historical and canonical context. These have been mainly for the newsletter of the Canon Law Society of Great Britain and Ireland, a society of which he was president from 2013 to 2016, and of which he's currently a trustee. And as seems only right, he's been awarded honorary life membership of the society in recognition of all the many services he's rendered it. So, Monsignor, welcome to Canonically Speaking, and I wonder if we could start by hearing a little bit about yourself, how you came to the priesthood, and what led you into the world of canon law.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be able to share a few thoughts with you today. I was born in Leigh-on-Sea, which is near Southend, only 30 miles or so from here. My father was a convert, my mother not a Catholic, and I was the only child of a second marriage. There was a big age gap, so effectively I was brought up as an only child. There weren't any Catholic schools, so I went to the local state schools. My godmother, who was my mother's best friend, was Catholic and made sure I made my first communion and confirmation preparation and so on. I suppose in some ways going to a non-Catholic school had its advantages because it meant that you were faced up with your faith being challenged on a day-to-day basis, and so you had to explore it for yourself. Most weeks I would pick up a sixpenny CTS pamphlet from the back of the church and gradually increase my knowledge of the faith in that way. After completing my school studies, I went to Oxford to read Greats, which is Latin and Greek literature, philosophy and ancient history at Exeter College. I had previously been involved with the choir in the parish at home, and when I returned home that first Christmas, the choirmaster, who didn't really know me very well, but that I was a student, said to me, "You're studying for the priesthood, aren't you?" So I said, no, it hadn't even crossed my mind at that stage. But it did plant a seed. And so over the years that followed, gradually that seed grew and took shape and a sense of direction. It was, of course, a time of great turmoil in the world. You had the student revolutions in France and elsewhere, in the church, Humanae Vitae. So again, that invited me to explore the faith at a deeper level, both intellectually and also in terms of prayer and faith. So it was during the course of that eventually I attended a vocations weekend in the summer of 1970, and that led me to apply to the Diocese of Brentwood, where I was accepted to begin studies for the priesthood in September 1971. I was sent to St Edmund's College, where, in the countryside, as it was then, before it moved into Chelsea to Beaufort Street. During the course of that, after the first year, a number of us were sent to Heathrock College to do our theology degree. I suppose it was really there that I became more interested in canon law. We had a very competent and interesting professor of canon law, Father Theodore Davy, a Passionist. So when at the end of my priestly studies, Bishop Casey asked me to do further studies, he wanted to know what I would like to study. I think my first choice would have been Scripture, but as he had already 2 people studying Scripture, that wasn't a very reasonable request. So I thought, well, I can do something with canon law, I can see its pastoral value, and also it meant that I could continue to make use of the knowledge of Latin that I had picked up in my university studies. So then, Chancellor and Judicial Vicar Michael Corley suggested it would be appropriate for me to spend a year in a parish first to get pastoral experience and to become a little bit involved in the work of the Chancery and Tribunal. So initially for that year I went in 1 day a week doing mainly preliminary interviews for marriage nullity cases. At the end of that year, I was sent to the Gregorian University in Rome to do the license in canon law. That was certainly made use of my good knowledge of Latin because the lectures were still in Latin at that stage. So I completed the license, returned to the diocese, and then basically I was doing perhaps 2 afternoons a week in the tribunal office, mainly preliminary interviews. At the end of the first year back, by which time we had a new bishop, Michael Corley was appointed VG. And so he wanted to gradually step away from his direct responsibilities as Chancellor and Judicial Vicar. I was appointed Vice-Chancellor at first, and then after a couple of years, Chancellor, and then a little later to be Judicial Vicar.
I wonder if you could say 1 or 2 words about what those roles actually involve.
Certainly. Well, the tribunal office exists for the most part to investigate cases of marriage nullity. And so there are various stages in that: to interview the people who are looking for a declaration of nullity, a preliminary interview, to prepare questions for potential witnesses and the other party, and at the end of all that to draw the case together, and then as a judge to sit with 2 other judges to reach a conclusion as to whether nullity has been proven or not. The role of Chancellor is more to deal with, for the most part, marriage papers, people getting married, dispensations for marriage, also the reception of people into communion with the Church, the RCIA process, and signing off their papers, giving delegation. But you also pick up a whole range of strange questions that don't come under anyone else's remit, that tend to end up in the Chancery office, sometimes to do with property, sometimes to do with religious communities, various questions of that kind. So that would take up 2 afternoons a week. Gradually, we were able to form a team of lay people who could take on the work of interviewing people for the preliminary interviews and also witnesses for marriage nullity cases. That helped to take some of the burden off parish priests who often had to perform that task before. And so over time, my role of doing preliminary interviews diminished. The focus was more on judging cases, writing sentences, and so on.
Now, when you were in Rome studying canon law, it must have been a very strange time. Everyone knew that the first code, the Code of 1917, was going to make way for a new version, which was being revised in such a way as to reflect the conclusions of the Second Vatican Council. So I wonder if you're able to give a picture of the difference between how canon law was regarded prior to the promulgation of the new code, during the last days of the old code, and afterwards.
It was a very interesting time to be studying canon law. By that stage, of course, a number of changes had come into effect following the decrees of Vatican II, but it had not yet been consolidated. Equally, the commission preparing the text of the new code was at work. Draft texts of the new canons were available for study. So from the point of view of students, we started from the 1917 code, and we had to study the whole of it, apart from 1 or 2 more obscure elements such as canonization of saints, which were left to one side. But in the light of those changes that had already been made and what was being proposed for the future. So you had a good knowledge of where the new code was coming from, both in terms of the foundations in the 1917 code, many of which were retained, but also the new perspective of the teachings of Vatican II.
You joined the Canon Law Society, I suppose, when it was still in its relative infancy. Can you remember some of the characters and personalities who belonged to it at that time?
Certainly, yes. My first conference was in 1977, when I had just begun work in the tribunal, and there were still quite a few members who had been there from its foundation in the late 1950s. Leading lights were Monsignor Jerry Sheehy from Dublin and Ralph Brown from Westminster. But also there were others, John Humphreys, who was from Birmingham Diocese, my own parish priest at home, Monsignor Daniel Shanahan, although he was not so much involved on a day-to-day basis, but he did come to some of the conferences. There was a little break then, from my point of view, when I went to study canon law in Rome, and my first conference on return was 1981, and after that I was at virtually every conference each year.
The format and certainly the locations of the conferences have changed dramatically. Do you have any memories of those early conferences?
Well, I certainly do. The first one I went to was in Scotland. It was at a youth centre in the middle of the countryside and somewhat basic, shall we say. The main thing was the people, of course, rather than creature comforts. After that, it moved to London Colney, the pastoral centre there, but it rotated 1 year in England, 1 year in Scotland, another year in Ireland, and the Irish venue was again rather basic. It was the novitiate for the Christian Brothers at Swords outside Dublin, and the rooms were extremely small and the food left a certain amount to be desired. But again, it was the people, not so much the physical comforts. But after a double booking for the following year at London Colney, we were not able to go there, and so the move was made to hotels after that rather than religious houses, and that certainly improved the comfort factor.
In your day-to-day work, you'll have lived through some significant changes in the law, especially regarding the way of dealing with marriage nullity cases. Can you describe what difference, if any, this has made on the tribunal's activity?
I think the main impact of the document Mittis Judex that came out under Pope Francis, from the point of view of our tribunal, was the dropping of the requirement for a mandatory appeal to conforming sentences in favour of nullity. That meant that it was much quicker to reach a resolution. Very few people would appeal from that, and so cases were dealt with more quickly. The alternative procedure, simplified procedure, that was on offer, hasn't really been particularly helpful. I can imagine there are circumstances where it would be, but in our country, a lot of the witnesses are scattered, and the procedure presupposes an oral hearing with all the parties and the witnesses gathered together in one place, and that really has not proved easy to arrange. So I think it has not been the benefit that it might be in some countries in our own case.
Another very significant revision to the law has been that of Book 6 of the Code of Canon Law on the penal law, the criminal law of the Church. And I wonder, again, whether this has had any significant impact on your day-to-day work.
To some extent, I think it's provided greater clarity on a number of points, and also areas that perhaps hadn't really been prominent before, but perhaps have taken a greater significance in recent years. For example, perhaps financial misbehaviour, irresponsibility, where it has provided for actions to be taken, penalties to be imposed in case of negligence or fraudulent activity, and so on. We haven't had many such cases, but we know the machinery is there. And of course, it has made a difference that in England and Wales, we have the establishment of a separate penal tribunal for the Bishops' Conference. I was asked to be one of the advocates to assist that, although I've not so far had any direct involvement in individual cases.
You've done a lot of behind-the-scenes work as well in things like remuneration of priests and the employment status of priests, of Catholic priests in England.
Yes, that's true. And I think sometimes it has come as a direct question as to entitlement. Sometimes it has been more a question of establishing, for example, liability in civil law, which depends on the degree of control exercised by a diocese towards the priests concerned. And so I was called to be an expert witness in a particular case which revolved around whether a diocese could be held liable for the action of a particular priest. And the whole issue was, is he employed? How far is the diocese responsible for his actions?
And is he employed?
The short answer to that is he's not employed. He is regarded as a worker, and there is seen to be some degree of vicarious liability on the part of the Church for those in that position, but he's not strictly an employee. I can imagine that that might change. There's a constant drift in terms of governance and so on, that the government, I think, would prefer to have one status that's applied to all the clergy of different denominations. It would make life simpler for them. It would make life more complicated for the bishops, not least because it would mean that clergy were subject to the general provisions of employment law, not simply in terms of liability, and that would raise question marks about the hours worked and salary and pensions and other such factors as well.
I suppose the other big area, of course, is that of child protection and safeguarding. And I imagine that this and related considerations take up quite a lot of your time these days.
Well, they do, and it's a big issue. I mean, particularly at the level of parishes, to ensure that people, not just the clergy, but lay employees and people working in parishes have the appropriate checks carried out, but also that there is a positive attitude to see it something not simply as an imposition, but a desire to secure the well-being of not only children and young people, but also vulnerable adults. And sometimes there are issues involved that are not sexual in nature, but, for example, perhaps the manipulation of those who are frail for financial reasons or other things like that. So there are issues there. Fortunately, we haven't had many cases in our diocese, but we have to be prepared.
Well, thank you, Monsignor, for these recollections and reflections. It's been a real pleasure listening to you and very helpful. I see you were ordained in July 1976, so we wish you well as you prepare soon to enter into what will be the 50th year of your priesthood. And we hope that you can continue to enrich the world of canon law with your experience, your insights, your advice and your guidance, as well as all that quiet work behind the scenes, all of which has proved to be of enormous benefit to so many of those who are working in the field of canon law, especially in these islands. So thank you, Monsignor, and God bless. Thank you again to my guest today, Mgr Gordon Read, and to my producer, Charlie Brown. And thank you to Emma Setiardi for her rendition of C.P.E. Bach's Solfeggetto, which opens and closes this podcast. I'm Fr Paul Hayward, and you've been listening to Canonically Speaking. Please be sure to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts for more conversations from the world of canon law. Until the next time, thank you and God bless.